Part 6. The last green land upon which we would set foot was that of South Georgia, a sprawl of near-drowned mountain peaks, close to 1,000 miles from the southern extremity of Argentina, and the home and death of that beckoning icon of Leroy's colonial fantasy, Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton had died aboard the Quest while harbored safe in the embrace of the island's mossy limbs, still planning his vaguely defined final assault upon the continent that had consistently deflected his overtures with such punishing repetition. Yet, though defined by his failures, the man was worshipped and remembered in an even greater light than others who had achieved the goals which fate had denied him. His grave, just 1 year old on the day of our arrival, wore a beer's worth of fresh flowers, clearly not left by the crew of stinking whale cutters who shared that bay. And I'm sure in the decades since I left the world, that garden has only become more overgrown. The grave marker itself is a squared stone pole the height of a man, and it looms oafishly over the rest in the small yard. Its rough-hewn face set with a Browning quote, "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life's set prize." The kind of inspirational effluvia born of the corrupt and corrupting mindset they call manifest destiny, which, at its best, buoys the souls of those who lead lives of leisurely yearning, so they may imagine that they share a grand spiritual commonality with the mad and the dead, and at worst inspires reckless dullards to action at the cost of braver men. Leroy, of course, was of the latter mob, but not even the surrogate glory of those bones could motivate him to make the short journey ashore upon our arrival, because over the previous weeks the man had become more and more seriously ill the further south we sailed. At first, we believed it to be the pitching of the sea. The men's claims about the South Atlantic had proven out, and I myself had struggled to stay on 2 feet for much of the later voyage, occasionally grabbing for the railing to steady both my outward balance and my inward constitution. But it was not seasickness in Leroy. And so here I must admit what may have been a great failing on my part. For it is possible that my personal feelings led me astray, and through inaction, I broke my sacred oath as regards this man. Not that I despised him or wished him ill. Rather, it was something more upsetting, and I feel shame for it even now, alone in this house, as far from judgment as I am from the life of the world. Because for all the good days I had spent with the men of the Beacon Hill, and for all the brotherliness we shared, I recognized I was at the fringe of the crew's acceptance. And my lack of shipboard experience made me, even considering my medical knowledge, of the least immediate use. And among men, to be of use is often the greatest bond. Against this, Leroy was my backstop, my effigy, my sacrifice. As long as he was there to absorb their curses and derision, as long as he existed as the border between competency and privilege, as long as he was the mindless reason for our toil, and the feckless embodiment of an unjust universe, then even the least among us, lowly as he may be, could feel secure in their place. So surely Leroy's sickness was seasickness like my own. It had to be, or else it was I who was once again tied at the wrists and sunk beneath the waves. And so I did not allow myself to realize my responsibility, and he grew worse when I could have intervened. How different all our lives might have been if I had. On the 3rd day of the man's absence from the deck, however, we had all become unnerved. I could see now some of the men looking to the horizon with a grim worry in their eyes. It was one thing to be captained by a fool, but to have no captain at all gave them the sense that we weren't so much sailing over a flat ocean, but slipping over the edge of a waterfall. So I finally gathered my instruments and went to see Leroy. Corwin caught me at the door, however. "I have him," he said. "He will revive apace." In the crook of his arm was a bowl of yellowish water and a stained rag. I peered over the lanky man's shoulder. In the dark cabin, Leroy sat shirtless, shining with sweat, bruised at the eyes, leaning against the backboard. Wet linen was heaped around his hair, frosted belly, and his head was dipping and lifting like a thirsty bird's. The room smelled like burning oil. "I have him. Now go on. I have him." Corwin pushed me back, closed the door, and locked it. That night, I dreamt of my father, lying in bed in the shadows of our old lost home. The floor was slick with spilled wine, and the last, or perhaps first, light of the sun burned like fire at the edges of the windows. Outside, the thrum and thunder of artillery smothered 1,000 screams, and the spattering earth from every detonation hit the roof again and again in wet, awful clods of mud and bone. In the morning, a plump, dark green line appeared along the rim of the sky, and by noon we had anchored at South Georgia. Corwin emerged from Leroy's cabin and pronounced that the trial had passed, but still the captain would not be joining us ashore. Instead, he requested that the strongest make themselves available to lift him in his chair atop the forecastle, so that he may see us off and take in the beauty of this austral summer day. They did so, and I stayed for a time, sitting beside the sick man. He was wrapped to his boots in a nest of blankets, and he was silent, watching the men as they left in groups, rowing back and forth to the dock. It was a shining, brilliant afternoon, and the beacon hill was far enough out that we could see all of the inward shore. 1,000 diving gulls swarmed the whaling station at the base of the gray mountains beyond, and the men there wore spiked boots as they worked the bulk of the stripped leviathan, hacking at it with knife-tipped poles, dislocating its massive skull from the ruin of its body, and taking it to the sawhouse. Smoke poured up from the buildings around the industrial tripods, and the shadow of that column swept over the water to the arms of the land, and finally out to Shackleton's grave, where we saw a number of the men had collected. A small sheet of paper fluttered in the captain's mittened hand, and I took it from him gently before the wind could, though he didn't seem to notice. It was a note written in his own script, nearly illegible, but after studying it for a few minutes I made out Shackleton's name, and I realized it was a speech that Leroy had meant to give to all of us in that very graveyard. I looked at him then, as he looked at his men gathered in the distance round that monument, and I wondered for whom Leroy had truly written this late eulogy. Shortly thereafter I took my turn on the shore and went to the stone myself. It was near evening by that point, and I was alone. I reached into my pocket, took out the note, and buried it beneath the remaining flowers. I then returned to the ship, hoping in vain to have left my nightmares behind.